Assalamu alaikum. This is Ms. Shanila Kaval from Guards Public Higher Secondary School 1. Today, I'm here with the first lecture of English literature. Before I start my first lesson, I would like to share the syllabus of first term with you. Number 1, the silver lining. Number 2, extreme weather. And number 3 is when I heard the learned astronomer. It's a poem. Our first lesson is The Silver Lining, and this story is written by an Indian English novelist, Dr. Chaman Nehru. He was born in Sialkot in 1927. He was an Indian novelist writing in English. His best known novel is Azadi, written in 1975, and he was honored with Sahitya Academic Award in 1977 for Azadi. Every cloud has a silver lining. It means there is always hope in the most difficult situations. So, one should never feel hopeless because difficult times always lead to better days. And the same thing is reflected here. In this I'll give story. You the introduction to the characters. Mr. Nadeem, the narrator, and the guest at the guest house. Mr. and Mrs. Ahad, owners of the guest house. Maheen, main character of the story and daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ahad. She was deaf and dumb. Mr. David, a mysterious guest who brings a ray of hope in Mahi's life. The story begins with the description of the guest house. In this story, the narrator, Mr. Nadeem, narrated his experience during his stay at a private guest house, which was recommended by one of his friends. The guest house was full of facilities. It was close to the bus stop, market, and the post office. The cuisine was excellent and the environment was peaceful. The best thing about the guest house was its owners, Mr. and Mrs. Ahad. When Mr. Nadeem reached the guest house, he was welcomed warmly by Mr. and Mrs. Ahad. During the conversation, a little girl caught Mr. Nadeem's attention. It was Maheen. She was barely 8 years old and was sweet and charming. She was the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ahad. Mr. Nadeem wanted to start up a conversation with her, but she was too shy and hid behind the settee. When Mr. Nadeem asked her name, she just shook her head and ran away. The Ahads really felt it, and they had a painful look on their faces. Mr. Nadeem was explained about Maheen's disability and that not only happened for the first time. Every time a new guest arrived and things would happen repeatedly. The questions of guests were usually personal, about her treatment. And the whole scenario was really giving a hard time to the parents. The parents had to cope up with this situation on a daily basis. There was no school in the neighborhood to provide special education to such children. Mr. Nadeem gave an idea to save the child from such repeated humiliation. He suggested them to keep typed chits properly sealed in envelopes and write a brief note mentioning child's disability and request the guest not to ask her any question. Then one day there arrived a mysterious guest, Mr. Tabit. He was barely 25 years old and had an unkempt appearance. Mrs. Ann asked him few questions about his journey, but he simply nodded and shrugged his shoulders in response. Meanwhile, he took out the typed chit, and after reading the note about Maheen, he rushed out into the courtyard where Maheen was sitting near the flower beds. Mrs. Ah didn't like Mr. Tabit's strange behavior and she got angry. The Ahads and Mr. Nadeem walked out to the veranda immediately. But what they saw there was unbelievable. Maheen was happy and comfortable with Mr. David. She was sitting on his lap, and Mr. David was showing her the flowers. The tension in the air was replaced by Maheen's laughter. David was also deaf and dumb, and he could only communicate through gestures. He was sent abroad to an institution where he had learned communication skills. He had planned to open a school in Pakistan for deaf and dumb children. He wished to make Maheen his first student. This news brought great joy and comfort to the parents. They showed their gratitude to Mr. David, and in the end of the story, Mrs. Ahad was described as the happiest woman in the world, and she laughed like a carefree girl. Now, review of the lesson. In this story, it is described that we should not judge anyone by his appearance. It is likely possible that a man who looks happy is just pretending himself, and he may be deeply hurt inside, while a person who looks stupid may be truly happy. Every person has a different story of pain, struggle, and survival. It's better not to interfere in others' matters, as it may cause trouble for others. Whatever the situation is, we must not lose hope because Allah Almighty is always with us and He shows us the right way. This is your first assignment, and here you have to pick the correct answer from the given options in the bracket. And for this, you have to read the lesson thoroughly. The second assignment is about Helen Keller. Despite her disabilities, she inspired the world with her determination and proved that disability is not inability. So, in this assignment, you have to complete the given activity by finding out mentioned details about her.